God's people say amen.
Amen.
For those of you who have not had the opportunity to read the last newsletter, I invite you to read Dave Wheatman's letter, if you would please, in reference to Scrooge. There are a lot of Scrooges this time of the year, aren't there? Scrooges who look upon the world, look upon our behavior as a totality, and say that we have a lot of work to do. And it's true. True that there are Scrooges running around who have a blatant and crass attitude towards this time of the year. They have what some would refer to as attitudinal issues. And indeed, they do. But more than anything, we need to look at our own attitudinal issues. How do we, as individuals, look upon each other? How do we, as individuals, look upon the world? What is our attitude? One of the things that I've noticed over the years that the Gospel according to St. Luke really targets and focuses on women a great deal more than the other Gospels. From Mary to Elizabeth to Mary Magdalene to Joanna, and the list goes on. Lifting up some of the most important people in our lives. Women. In a world and in a culture that often focuses so much on men. This time of the year, as we look at this scene, and we've seen it, most of us, many, many times. The simple scene, the baby, the mom and dad, shepherd, wise ones, wise men, who we always mark as three, but we don't know how many there were. We do know there was gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but we don't know how many wise men there were. Wise men. In spite of the war, and the starvation, and the pain, and the suffering, and in the injustice that we see in the world. Or rather, because of the wars, and because of the starvation, the pain, and suffering, and because of the injustice, God saw that we were lost and sent to us His Son, innocently at first, wrapped in swaddling clothes, very vulnerable, just as we are vulnerable. It is not just a story, as our choir shared with us a little bit ago. It is the greatest story. And it is the greatest story because it is true. It is true, and it penetrates our hearts in ways and sometimes that we don't even fully understand. I'll give you an example. Just last week, we had a fantastic display of the interpretation of the story of Christ told through emojis. As I said last week, I would have not thought of that. I'm sure the majority of us would not have thought of that, but thankfully somebody did. Because it is a remarkable story that needs to be told over and over again in fresh and new ways. And I'll tell you a little story about another Christmas story at a small church whose leadership chose Wally to be the innkeeper. You know the story of that the family comes to the inn and they're told no. Well, Wally at this particular church was chosen. Wally was big for his age. Some people wondered why Wally was chosen. Wally wasn't exactly too eloquent, but after all, Wally's role in the story was just a very small piece. All Wally had to do was say, "There is no room at the inn." That was the extent of Wally's role in the story. And as the story goes, as we know, Joseph and Mary came. They were looking for a place to stay. The scene was set perfectly in place for Wally to have his say, that there was no room at the inn. So Joseph entered the stage. "Please, sir, my wife is not well. Could we have a room for the night?" And Wally began to speak. "I'm sorry." And then, just then, Wally stopped. And Wally failed to deliver his line. Wally failed to deliver his line because what spoke from Wally at that point in time came from his heart and from his soul. In desperation, Wally, much to the chagrin of Wally's parents, Wally spoke out and said, "Look, there's plenty of room at my house. Just come home with me." I love the way Wally changed the story. It's not a story of ancient times. It is a story of today, of 2018, soon to be 2019 and beyond. It is the greatest story, for it is a story that lives in our hearts and in our souls. It lives in Wally. It lives in you, if you are but willing to step out of the shadows of the past and to step into the brightness of the future. There was no room at the inn for Joseph and Mary and the economic world of its day. There was no room at the inn in the legal realm of their day. After all, they were told to go by the powers that be, to go and register. And so they did. There was no room for Jesus in the religious order of its day. There was no room for Jesus in the politics of the day. And Wally understood that deep within his heart and soul. And so do you. So do you. Now, I'm not Wally, although I could have been, I suppose, if I had been so bold at that young age. But I remember vividly, and it always comes back to my mind, and my wife Krista will attest to this every single year I bring it up. Christmas Day, 1976. I was in Alexandria, Egypt, on the USS Guam. And I recall waking up on Christmas morning, standing on the deck of the ship, looking down at the docks. And there were the people, working in earnest, repairing the docks, in loincloths only. The heat and the sand was intense. And I'm standing on the deck of a mighty warship in the Holy Land. And I'm thinking to myself, how strange this is, that here I am on Christmas morn, not far from the place where my Lord and King was born. How strange. And strange indeed. It is stable time, my sisters and brothers. As it was for me in 1976, as I stood there and looked down at these people working, it is stable time to stop wherever where you're at and remember this simple story, the greatest story, where God looked down upon us and saw our laboring, the intensity, the stress. Saw that we were lost in the day and that we had to be found. And the only way that He saw that we could be found was to send His Son to us. And so He did. As the choir sang for us, the greatest story, He chose to send His Son to show us that there was and that there is a much, much better way to live together. And there is a true way to be the children of God. But it is in Him and through Him that this is found. I want to conclude this morning's message with a simple challenge. And it is pretty simple, but it's not necessarily easy, as often the spiritual path reveals itself to be. How many of you, at the end of the day, greet your spouse, your friend, your children perhaps, your parents, and go, "How was your day?" How many of you do that? Good, good. Try something different though next time. Instead of "How was your day?" Where did you meet God today? Where did you meet God today? It's a little different. It's okay to say, "How was your day?" But perhaps step it up just a little bit. It's an invitation. I invite you to think about it. But tomorrow evening, and perhaps this week, at the end of the day, instead of "How was your day?" where did you meet God today? Amen. O little town of Bethlehem,